This past year was the first time that I incorporated sketchnoting into my instruction. At the end of the year, my students and I reflected on the different ways that sketchnoting had helped us as learners. And in reading my students' comments, there were 4 primary benefits that kept coming up over and over. First, it helped improve their comprehension of both literary and informational text. Secondly, sketchnoting inspired them to create their own content, so they weren't just consuming text and analyzing them, but the act of sketchnoting helped them to think about how might they craft their own text. Third, sketchnoting helped my students to see connections not only between different parts of a text, but then to relate it to other texts that they may have studied. Last but not least, and most importantly, sketchnoting was an activity and a learning strategy that helped build my students' confidence as both readers and as learners. And whether I was looking at reflections in the work of students who were in an advanced 11th grade language arts class or students who were in a remedial course, sketchnoting seemed to be the strategy that was the great equalizer and that helped give students access to different types of text. I'd like to share with you briefly just some of those reflections that my 11th graders shared. One of my juniors shared this: sketchnoting helps me break down complex text and has improved my reading skills. It gives me an alternative way to show my understandings. And we all know that each and every student is different in what they bring to the table as readers and as learners, and how they might demonstrate their understanding of a text or a concept. For my students, they especially love sketchnoting because they weren't locked into showing their understanding in just one medium with a written paragraph. Sketchnoting was almost, if you might say, a type of formative assessment for me to see where they were with their understandings. And students in all levels of courses appreciated having sketchnoting as a way for them not only to analyze a text, but then to show their peers as well as me, their teacher, what was happening with their thinking as they were looking at a text. Another student shared that sketchnoting a poem not only helped me understand the text structure, but it also inspired me to write my own poem using that text structure. The act of visualizing the poem with sketchnoting helped me to really see the structure. Reading a poem by Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman is not an easy task at any age, but especially for young learners in 11th grade, those definitely are on the higher end of text complexity. So for my students, not only to be able to really look at a poem and to dig deep into it and to have access to the poem through sketchnoting, but to also then have the ability to be inspired by what they saw in the text structure through their sketchnoting, I think speaks volumes as to the volume of sketchnoting. So if you're working with mentor text, sketchnoting can be a great way for students to really dig deep and see and visualize that text, but then to also take that structure and be inspired to create one of their own using that same structure. That is no small feat for any grade level, but especially high schoolers if you've taught upperclassmen, to have a strategy that generates that kind of excitement and interest in a complex text. Another student shared that sketchnoting poems helped her to see the connection between word choice and tone. And of course, we know that literary concepts like these are embedded in our standards, whether you are using Common Core or some other set of standards. But sketchnoting helps students to take an abstract concept and to make those connections and to make those literary concepts like diction and tone much more concrete and tangible. Last but not least, sketchnoting a piece of literature has helped me grow as a writer because the visual act of elaborating with details in my sketch notes helps me understand how to execute that skill with traditional writing. Of course, we always want our students to elaborate when they are writing an essay that might be something like a literary analysis or a piece of exposition. But for my students, sketchnoting really helped them hone in on those fine details and engage in close reading without it feeling as though it was some type of terrible chore, if you will, which is sometimes what we think of when we think of close reading. But instead, sketchnoting made looking at a text closely and visualizing it and thinking about the important parts a joyful act. And then for students to transfer what they see in their sketch notes when they began to visually see the pieces of the puzzle and to understand how a writer might elaborate with significant details and to build depth to a piece of writing, when they can see that, but because they've sketch noted that text, again, it's almost now you're thinking about mentor text and thinking about how does that translate to my own writing? How is that helping me to grow not only as a reader but as well as a writer? These were very powerful insights for not only my students but for me as their teacher, to see the value in making time and space and incorporating sketchnoting into our daily lives in our language arts classroom, whether we were working with literary texts, pieces of nonfiction, or informational text like an article of the week.